Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The rain in Belmere wasn't just water from the sky, it was memory falling from heaven. Soft and lingering, it whispered across rooftops like old stories, clinging to chimneys and slipping down glass panes like teardrops from the past. The village, nestled in a cradle of low hills and quiet woods, seemed to fold inward on itself when it rained, drawing every noise down to a hush. The stone houses with moss-capped roofs, the winding footpaths that knew every footstep by heart, the willows bent low over the narrow river that locals simply called the stream. Everything in Belmere moved with patience. It was a place where time had no sharp edges, where nothing truly arrived in a hurry, and where silence felt like it had been poured into the earth before the first home was built. And yet, even in this hushed corner of the world, inside one particular house at the end of Haythorn Lane, silence was a rare visitor. That house, painted a weary shade of blue, worn by weather and age, held within it the sounds of one woman's voice stretching across every inch of the walls, brushing every curtain and curling itself into every shadow. Martha Whitlock, who had lived in that house for nearly 23 years with her husband Gerald, had a tongue as lively as a summer robin. She spoke of everything, of the way the butter always seemed too soft in July, of the neighbor's cat who never really liked fish, of the ghost of her mother who she believed still turned off the light in the cellar every night. And it wasn't just what she said, it was the way she said it, full of wonder, emphasis, and a kind of breathless charm that made even silence want to lean closer and listen. Gerald had once been enthralled by her voice. In the early days, when the threads of their life together were still new and golden, he used to watch her from across the dinner table with quiet awe, as though she were reciting poetry, even when she was just talking about the price of onions at the market. But over time, something in him withered. Where once he had seen a lively spirit, he now saw a woman who filled the room with words like dust settling on forgotten shelves. He became withdrawn, not out of malice but out of exhaustion, as if each word she spoke scratched against the glass of his mind. He found himself retreating more often, into the garden, into the woods, into the corners of the house where her voice couldn't quite reach. He no longer looked at her when she spoke. He nodded, occasionally muttered a word in response, but mostly he gave her his silence the way one gives a gift they hope will be enough. Martha, too bright to miss the growing emptiness, began to speak even more. She filled the space he left behind with words, thinking, perhaps, that if she just kept talking, she could stitch the fraying edges of their marriage back together. She told stories to the walls, made jokes to the tea kettle, read poetry to the garden roses. And though her tone remained cheerful, inside her chest a quiet ache was forming, like a damp corner that nobody notices until the paint begins to peel. She knew something was breaking. She just didn't know what it would cost to mend it. Their house, though modest in shape, was a maze of memories. The creaky floorboard outside the kitchen door that always gave Martha away when she went for a midnight snack. The dusty photograph of them on their wedding day, hung slightly crooked above the fireplace. A younger Martha beaming in a simple white dress, Gerald looking stiff in his suit, trying to smile. There was the armchair by the window that had become Gerald's throne, where he sat unmoved for hours, staring blankly at the trees beyond the fence, as though hoping the rustle of leaves would drown out his wife's voice. But perhaps the most telling corner of the house was the small sewing room upstairs, where Martha spent her afternoons embroidering flowers onto old pillowcases. She spoke to her needles, scolded her thread when it tangled, told stories to her pincushion shaped like a tomato. And in that room, when the sunlight fell just right through the lace curtain, her voice softened, not out of sorrow, but out of solitude. She didn't need to be heard there. She just needed to exist. Gerald never entered that room. Not once. It had become her sanctuary, and he in exile. Instead, he passed his time in the shed out back, a wooden structure that smelled of old oil and damp wood. There he carved pieces of wood into nothing in particular, letting the silence press against his skull like a cold cloth. The birds would sometimes watch him from the fence, heads tilted, as if trying to understand the stillness that clung to him like a second skin. One particularly gray afternoon, a chill wind crept under the door and made the curtains shiver. Martha was peeling potatoes in the kitchen, humming an old song her mother used to sing. Her hands moved with the grace of someone who had done this 1,000 times, yet there was a tremor in her rhythm, a slight pause, a lost beat. Gerald sat at the table, reading the same newspaper he'd read for the last 3 days, his eyes tracing the faded print without comprehension. Martha tried to fill the silence with a question about the weather, a comment on Mrs. Calloway's broken fence, and a memory about the time the rooster wandered into their sitting room. He didn't answer. Not even a glance. The words hung in the air like smoke from a damp fire. And then she said, half-jokingly, "You'd rather be deaf, wouldn't you, Gerald?" She laughed, softly, expecting at least a grunt. But instead, he folded the newspaper, stood, and walked to the window. He placed a hand on the sill and stared out at the trees, the same way he always did when he wanted to vanish without moving. Martha watched him, the potato forgotten in her palm. Her laughter withered in her throat. She said nothing more. Not that day. Not the next. But a shift had occurred, a crack in the glass. From that moment on, something unseen began to grow between them. It moved like ivy across the surface of their lives, slow and deliberate, coiling around habits and routines, pressing gently not to strangle, but to separate. And though neither of them named it, they both felt it. The quiet was no longer just silence. It had become presence. And presence, once it begins to listen, hears everything. The sun had started rising a little later each day, dragging its golden light across Belmere's sloped fields like a reluctant promise. Mornings in the Whitlock household had once been filled with the comforting hum of routine, the clatter of spoons, the kettle's whistle, the low chatter of Martha commenting on the clouds. But lately, those sounds had begun to feel disjointed, as if something had broken in the middle of a song, and no one had the courage to fix the note. Gerald woke early, but not out of habit or desire. His sleep had grown shallow, full of restless tossing and muted dreams he couldn't quite remember, but always left him unsettled. He'd sit on the edge of the bed in the half-light, staring at the floorboards, listening to the house breathe. Martha, still curled under the patchwork quilt, would sometimes murmur in her sleep, speaking to someone only she could see. When she awoke, she smiled as always, kissed him on the shoulder, and asked if he'd like porridge or toast. He never answered. She always made both. It wasn't that he didn't love her, he couldn't say if he did or didn't anymore. That word had lost its sharpness in his mouth. What he felt now was something duller, heavier, like trying to breathe through wool. Her voice, which once made him feel alive, now rang in his ears long after she left the room. It lingered behind him like a smell, haunting him in places where he should have been alone. And he hated himself for that. But no matter how tightly he clenched his fists or gritted his teeth, the feeling wouldn't leave. The more she spoke, the more he shrank inside himself, like a man pulling into his coat in the cold, not knowing the chill was in his bones. There were small things, peculiar things, that Gerald had started doing without even knowing why. He began spending longer hours in the woods, wandering without direction, stepping over fallen branches and dodging the briars that seemed to reach for him like grasping hands. Sometimes he'd sit near the brook, watching the water drag leaves along its lazy path, imagining what it would feel like to simply follow it. No bag, no word, just the sound of the water and the brush of wind against his cheeks. On other days, he took to visiting old Mr. Tunney in Evershade, the village a few miles east, where no one asked too many questions. Mr. Tunney ran a dusty little shop that sold herbs, tinctures, roots, powders, items steeped in folklore and suspicion. The windows were darkened with soot and vines, and the bell above the door always rang half a second too late. Gerald never stayed long. He would ask about certain plants, what they did, how they tasted, how much it took to quiet a cough or still a racing heart. Tunney, half-blind and entirely unbothered, gave him answers with the tone of someone who had seen too much to be surprised. "For sleep?" the old man would ask. Gerald would nod. "Gentle sleep," Gerald would mutter. "No pain. Just quiet." The man would hand him small sachets, unlabeled, tied with twine. "You'll know what to do." On his walks home, Gerald would tuck the parcels deep into his coat pocket, pressing his fingers against them like a child hiding candy. He told himself he was only curious. A precaution. But each time he held them, his thoughts grew darker, clearer, like a path becoming visible under fallen snow. And when he returned home, Martha would greet him at the door with her usual cheer, never asking where he'd been. She trusted him. Or maybe she didn't, but loved him too much to say it out loud. Martha, on her end, had not been blind to the shift. She was many things, soft-hearted, talkative, even naive in some eyes, but she wasn't foolish. She had always had a way of noticing things others missed. The change in Gerald hadn't come like a storm. It arrived slowly, like a curtain being drawn one thread at a time. He smiled less, looked away more. His answers had turned to shrugs. He no longer commented on the taste of her stews or the scent of her perfume. She noticed how he washed his hands twice before touching anything she cooked, how he sometimes smelled the cups before pouring tea. At first, she thought perhaps he was ill. She offered to take him to Dr. Hartridge, but he refused with a grunt. She tried to be patient, telling herself this was a season. But days turned into weeks, and the warmth between them became a stranger. She began keeping to herself more, spending longer hours upstairs in her sewing room, embroidering names into napkins no one would ever use. She found peace in small stitches, in order, in the tiny victories of thread crossing cloth. And even there she spoke, quietly to the room, to the air. "You're not the same, Gerald," she'd whisper. "I still see you, but I don't feel you." Sometimes she cried, but only in the evening, when the light through the lace curtain made it easier to pretend it was just dust in her eyes. On one of these afternoons, while cleaning the pantry, she found the small bottle tucked behind the pickled onions. Greenish liquid. No label. It smelled wrong, like something growing in darkness. She didn't scream. She didn't even gasp. She stared at it for a long moment, then placed it back precisely where she found it. Afterward, she made stew for dinner, humming softly while she chopped carrots. She served it with buttered rolls, smiling gently as she ladled it into Gerald's bowl. He ate in silence, and she watched him with a calmness that felt strange even to herself. The following days unfolded like a peculiar dream where nothing was truly wrong, but everything felt off-kilter. The air in the house had changed. It had weight now, like it was holding its breath. Gerald was quieter than ever, and Martha, oddly enough, spoke less. She chose her words carefully, as if they were pearls she had to string precisely to keep them from falling apart. She stopped asking where he went or what he was thinking. Instead, she studied him, not with suspicion, but with a heartbreaking clarity, like a gardener realizing the roots of her favorite tree were rotting, and nothing she did would save it. Gerald, for his part, didn't notice her watching. He was consumed with his plan, though he didn't think of it as murder. He told himself it was a mercy. He imagined her drifting off to sleep one night after a warm meal, her breath slowing, her voice finally ceasing, her hands folding quietly on her lap. No fear, no pain. Just rest. He convinced himself it was kindness. But deep down, in the place he never allowed himself to look, he knew it was cowardice. He couldn't tell her to stop speaking, couldn't ask her to change. And so, like a man burning down his house to silence a squeaky door, he chose destruction over conversation. Martha continued setting the table with care, polishing the spoons, lighting a candle in the center, even on days with power. The rituals remained, even as the reason behind them vanished. In the evenings, she sometimes walked alone to the end of the garden, sat on the wooden bench under the plum tree, and spoke softly to the night. Her words had become prayers, silent pleas to whatever listened. She knew something was coming, and in a strange, cruel way she was ready. The morning came with no special markings. The sky bore the same dull, heavy gray it had worn for weeks, and the wind still pushed against the trees like a tired old man shouldering through a crowd. Martha had woken early, not from a dream, but from the sheer weight of stillness pressing against her chest. The house had grown unusually cold during the night, and though she lay beside her husband, the space between them had become a canyon. She stared at the ceiling for some time, her hands folded over her stomach, listening to the soft rise and fall of Gerald's breathing. It was not a peaceful sound, it was strained, deliberate, as though his body itself was trying to forget something. When she rose, the floorboards creaked beneath her feet like old bones, and she made her way down to the kitchen with careful steps, not out of fear but reverence. There was a finality in the air that she couldn't name, only feel. Her fingers moved over the counters like she was touching them for the last time, pausing on the chipped edge of the breadboard, the brass handle of the spice drawer. She boiled water, steeped tea, and sat by the window while the rain traced thin lines down the glass. Outside, the soil in the garden darkened under the drizzle, and she thought of the dahlias that never bloomed last spring. Some things simply stopped before they reached their full shape, she supposed. Gerald came down an hour later, his steps slow and measured. He didn't greet her. He rarely did now. She poured him tea without asking, placing the cup in front of him with the same quiet care one might offer a candle in a church. They didn't speak. They hadn't really in days. The silence no longer startled her. It had become a second language, spoken between glances, between footsteps, between the brief brushing of hands that no longer lingered. The rest of the day moved like something being pulled backward through a tunnel. Gerald spent most of it in the shed, though Martha didn't follow him or ask what he was doing there. She knew, or at least she believed she did, and naming it would only give it life. She folded laundry, ironed Gerald's shirts though he hadn't worn anything but his cardigan in weeks, and dusted the bookshelf no one had touched in years. It wasn't the chores themselves that mattered, it was the rhythm of them. The repetition made her feel tethered to something, even if that something was slipping away. At midday, she sat at the small writing desk near the stairs and opened the drawer that held her old recipe book, the one with her mother's handwriting faded to soft brown ink. She flipped through it slowly, stopping at the page labeled Evening Stew for Quiet Nights. The title made her pause. Not because of the stew itself, she knew the recipe by heart, but because of the way it now echoed something sinister. She copied the ingredients onto a scrap of paper anyway, using the same pen Gerald always complained leaked ink onto his fingertips. She left the book open on the desk, as if someone else might come along and need it later. When she entered the pantry to gather the vegetables, her eyes brushed over the back shelf, where the strange bottle still sat behind a stack of dusty preserves. It hadn't moved. Neither had she the first time she found it. She stood there now for a few moments longer, staring at it without reaching. She didn't need to. The plan that had been growing quietly in the corner of her mind was no longer a question. It had taken root, steady and calm. She gathered the potatoes, the leeks, the bay leaves, and carried them to the counter with hands that didn't shake. As she chopped and stirred, the kitchen filled with the familiar, comforting scent of stew, a scent so deeply tied to years of warmth and shared meals that, if one didn't know better, they might have believed this was a perfectly ordinary evening in a perfectly ordinary home. She set the table as she always did, aligning the spoons to the edges of the bowls, folding the napkins into soft triangles, lighting the stub of a candle that had burned through many dinners before this one. The fire in the hearth had grown low, casting flickering shadows that moved across the walls like distant memories. Martha called out to Gerald, her voice gentle, even musical, like a mother beckoning a child in from the cold. When he appeared, she smiled, not out of joy, but as a ritual, as something her face remembered how to do. He sat across from her in silence. The stew steamed between them, golden and rich, flecked with herbs. She waited as he reached for the ladle, and then, almost imperceptibly, her hand brushed his. "Let me," she said, lifting it with a smile so warm it could have fooled the devil himself. She filled the bowls slowly, giving his slightly more, sprinkling a pinch more salt, a touch more care. And when the bowls were set, she rose once more. "I forgot the bread," she said, walking to the counter. She took 2 rolls from the tin, and in that moment, with the slightest shift of her hands, she switched the bowls. Not with flourish, not with drama, just a quiet exchange, as practiced as blinking. When she returned, she placed a roll on each plate and folded herself into the chair as if nothing had changed. Gerald did not notice. He lifted his spoon and began to eat, his gaze fixed on the flame of the candle rather than her face. Martha watched him with the serenity of someone watching rain fall. She didn't eat right away. She didn't need to. The air between them was thick now, not with fear, but with the weight of what had been set in motion. It didn't happen immediately. That's what struck her first, the patience of it. Gerald ate 3 spoonfuls, then a 4th, pausing only once to wipe his mouth with a napkin. His face betrayed nothing, save for a small twitch at the corner of his jaw. Martha lifted her spoon finally, letting the broth touch her lips, and nodded thoughtfully. "It's good," she said, her voice low, almost reverent. He didn't answer. His brow furrowed slightly, like a man trying to remember something important. She watched the line of his throat as he swallowed. Time seemed to fold in on itself, turning seconds into long stretches of soundless waiting. He reached for his water glass, knocked it slightly, and caught it with a fumbling hand. His breath hitched then, not a gasp, not yet, but a change. She tilted her head. "You all right, Gerald?" she asked, her voice lighter than air. He blinked slowly. She could see the shift now, the way his pupils shrank, the way his grip on the spoon slackened. Still, he tried to hold composure, tried to fight the invisible tide rising in his chest. Another spoonful, another swallow. The candle flickered. And then his hand slipped, the spoon falling with a sharp clink against the porcelain, broth splashing across the linen. His face, once so tight and unreadable, began to unravel. Martha didn't move. She simply placed her spoon down gently and looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in weeks. His lips parted, but no sound came. His breathing grew shallow, his hands gripping the table's edge like a man reaching for land that wasn't there. Her eyes remained steady, unflinching, as the silence he had so deeply craved began to pull him under, inch by inch. The sound of the spoon hitting the floor echoed louder than it should have. It wasn't just the clink of metal on ceramic, it was the unraveling of something tightly held together, the tremor before the final fall. Gerald slumped forward slightly, but caught himself with a shaky hand. His body, once so rigid with control, now began to betray him in small, humiliating ways. His breaths came in uneven bursts, each one shallower than the last, as though the very air he'd always taken for granted had turned to glass in his lungs. Martha sat still, her posture easy and unforced, the back of her hand resting lightly against her cheek. She studied him not with malice, but with something closer to resignation. There was no gloating in her eyes, no fire of revenge flickering under the surface, only a deep, unsettling calm. Gerald's lips parted, but what came out was not a word, not even a whisper, only a rasping sound that resembled a man trying to speak in a dream. She leaned forward slightly, just enough for her voice to reach him without effort. "There's water on the tray," she said softly, motioning with her eyes to the glass near his elbow. He glanced toward it, but made no move. His fingers were trembling now, fluttering weakly like the wings of a dying moth. A bead of sweat rolled down the side of his face, slow and deliberate. The candlelight caught it, making it gleam like a tear he didn't mean to shed. Outside, the wind tapped against the kitchen window in irregular beats, like an old friend unsure of whether it should knock louder or leave. Minutes passed, though they felt longer, stretching into a quiet Gerald had once begged the world for. It had come, finally, and it was not what he expected. It did not soothe him. It did not embrace him like an old coat or rock him to sleep. It suffocated. It mocked. It crowded the space with everything left unsaid. Martha remained seated across from him, her expression unchanged. She watched the pulse in his neck, the growing pallor in his face, the way his knuckles turned white as he gripped the table's edge, holding on as though he still believed something might anchor him. He looked at her then, not quickly but slowly, deliberately, his eyes glassy, pupils contracted, mouth slack. There was no anger in his face, only a dreadful understanding. And for the first time in what felt like years, she met his gaze without blinking. "You thought I wouldn't notice," she said, her tone not accusing, but factual, like someone commenting on the weather. "That bottle tucked away behind the onions. The way you've been watching me like a man studying a problem he doesn't know how to solve." Gerald's throat moved, trying to force a swallow, but the muscles had begun to tighten, rebelling against the mind that still scrambled for escape. "I watched you measure it, stir it, wait for the right night," she continued. Her voice was slow and even, each word falling like a stone dropped into still water. "You wanted quiet. You wanted peace. But you didn't want to ask for it. You chose this instead." Her fingers tapped once against her bowl, a soft, rhythmic motion that betrayed no emotion. Gerald's breathing now sounded like paper tearing, thin and dry, more effort than it was worth. He leaned back suddenly, his chair scraping slightly as his body reacted to something deep inside shifting, failing. He didn't scream. He hadn't the strength. Martha stood. Not fast. Not hesitant. She rose like someone answering a door, someone attending to a long overdue task. Her steps were silent as she moved around the table. She didn't touch him, she didn't need to. She simply stood beside him for a long moment, looking down at what had once been her husband, and was now something rapidly fading. His eyes followed her, panic now fully bloomed in them, but dulled by the fog creeping steadily across his mind. She bent slightly, lowering herself to her knees beside him. From this position they were face to face, eye to eye. "There were so many ways to tell me you couldn't bear the sound of me anymore," she whispered, her voice nearly a breath. "You could have said it once. I would have listened. I always listened." Her hand hovered near his, not quite touching it, as if offering a gesture that neither of them believed in anymore. "But you didn't want me to know that I had power over you. That my voice, my presence, broke your stillness. You hated it, and because you hated your own weakness, you turned it into mine." Gerald's face contorted, his jaw tightening involuntarily, a sound escaping him like a wounded animal. His skin had turned a strange hue, part ash, part stone. His eyes darted to the window. The world beyond remained as unchanged as it had ever been. The birds hadn't stopped. The trees still swayed. But inside this room, time had stopped breathing. She looked at him not as a man dying, but as a man who had finally heard what he'd spent years trying not to. "I loved you," she said, "but love is not silent, and silence is not peace. You thought if you erased my voice, you'd find clarity. But you only found the echo of your own failure." He fell forward suddenly, not hard, but as if gravity had finally asked too much of him. His face hit the edge of the table before folding downward onto the floor. Martha didn't move. She sat back on her heels and watched him settle into stillness. The candle on the table flickered as though uncertain whether to stay lit. The stew, half-eaten in both bowls, had begun to cool. Her knees ached, but she made no motion to rise. There was something final in the air now, not just death, but the end of a long, slow war. The kind of war that doesn't involve swords, only silence. She turned her head slightly toward the window. The rain had stopped. The glass had cleared. The sky remained gray, but no longer weeping. And in that quiet, that true quiet, she let her thoughts drift, not to guilt, not to sorrow, but to release. She had not wished him dead, but she had allowed the moment to choose its path. And when it did, she did not interrupt it. Time passed. The shadows grew longer. The fire in the hearth gave one last sigh and died down to a dull glow. Finally she rose. Her joints cracked slightly from the cold floor, but she moved without hesitation. She took the bowls, carried them to the sink, and poured the contents down the drain. The stew spiraled away, leaving no trace behind. She washed the spoons, folded the napkins, and extinguished the candle with 2 fingers. When all was done, she turned off the kitchen light and stepped over his body without a second glance. Morning arrived without ceremony. There was no burst of light through the curtains, no bird song at the windowsill. Just a thick, gray haze hanging over Belmere like a heavy quilt. Martha stirred quietly from her sleep, her body reminding her that she'd spent the night not in bed, but curled up on the small sofa in the sitting room, wrapped in the old wool blanket that smelled faintly of mothballs and cedarwood. Her eyes took a few seconds to adjust to the dimness. She lay still for a long while, not out of exhaustion, but deliberation. The house was silent now, truly silent, not just quiet, but void of any presence besides her own. She could feel it. It wasn't simply that Gerald was no longer breathing in the next room. It was as if the very essence of him had been wiped from the air. No footsteps, no rustling of his paper, no coughing from the kitchen. His absence was almost architectural. She rose slowly, the floor cool beneath her feet. She didn't tiptoe. She moved as someone might in a house left empty by time rather than death, her steps measured and soft, not from fear, but from a sort of reverence. She made her way to the kitchen. The light was a pale smear across the tiles. The chair he had sat in remained pulled back, slightly angled, just as it was when he fell. The table had been cleared. No dishes, no crumbs, only the faintest ring where the stew bowl had once rested. She turned toward the body without blinking. He lay as he had the night before, one arm curled under him, the other splayed open like a broken wing. She did not cry. She did not cover him. Instead, she stood over him for several minutes, her arms crossed, eyes fixed on his face, as though waiting for a final word to rise from his lips. But none came. Martha knew what had to be done, not because anyone had ever told her what to do in a situation like this, but because something inside her had already decided. There would be no performance, no panic, no trembling voice recounting false shock to a neighbor. That wasn't how this would go. She filled the kettle, placed it on the stove, and turned the knob until the flame hissed to life. While the water heated, she went to the cupboard above the stove and pulled down a tin of Earl Grey, spooning leaves into the teapot with mechanical precision. Her hands moved with the same grace they always had during morning rituals, though the world around her had tilted on its axis. Once the tea steeped, she poured herself a cup, added a thin curl of lemon peel, and sat down in the chair opposite the one that had once been Gerald's. She took a slow sip, then another. Her gaze drifted not to the body, but to the window. The clouds remained unmoved, still hanging low, as if the sky itself had chosen not to participate today. After her tea, she rose and collected the items she needed from the linen closet. 2 old sheets, thick and heavy, usually saved for the coldest months. She returned to the kitchen and knelt beside Gerald. Her fingers worked quietly as she folded the sheet around him, tucking it at the edges as though she were wrapping something fragile. Not lovingly, but carefully. There was no hate in her touch, just finality. When he was covered, she sat back on her heels again, breathing deeply, the air catching slightly in her throat. She stood, smoothed down her skirt, and walked to the hallway where the telephone rested on a small table. She didn't dial right away. Instead, she stood looking at it, the silence of the house pressing against her skin. And then, without drama, she picked up the receiver and dialed the constable's number. The voice on the other end was familiar. Constable Renshaw, a man whose boots always seemed too large for his legs, answered with a groggy tone. She imagined him at his desk, feet up, a cup of strong tea in his hand, not expecting trouble in a place like Belmere. "Morning, Martha," he said, his voice thick with routine. "Everything all right down your way?" She hesitated for only half a second before responding, her voice calm, measured. "No, not quite," she said. "It's Gerald. I think he's passed." Silence followed, not because Renshaw didn't believe her, but because no one ever expected a call like this from Martha Whitlock. "Passed, you say?" he repeated slowly. "When?" She looked at the kitchen clock, its hands moving with perfect indifference. "Sometime last night," she replied. "I found him this morning on the kitchen floor." Another pause, followed by the sound of a pencil scribbling. "Did he have any known health issues?" he asked. "He'd been tired lately," she offered. "More tired than usual. Said he hadn't been sleeping well. That sort of thing." She kept her voice steady, never over-explaining. The constable promised to come round within the hour. She thanked him politely and hung up. The phone clicked back into place with a soft thud, and she stood for a moment, hands still resting on it. In the mirror across the hall, she caught her own reflection, pale, still, composed. The woman looking back at her didn't appear broken or bruised by grief. She looked like someone who had weathered a storm and found the world quieter afterward. Whether that quiet was peace or something else remained unspoken. By the time Renshaw arrived, the kitchen had been swept, the kettle was whistling, and Martha had changed into her navy blouse and long black skirt. Not funeral clothes, just something darker than usual. She met him at the door with her usual composure, stepped aside to let him in, and offered him tea before directing him to the kitchen. He declined politely and removed his cap, holding it against his chest as he knelt beside the body. His face, craggy and worn, showed no alarm, only the solemn attentiveness of a man doing what needed to be done. "He's cold," he muttered, mostly to himself. "Gone a few hours, I'd say." She nodded. "I made stew last night," she said softly. "He didn't say much during dinner. I thought maybe he was tired." Renshaw looked up at her. "He didn't complain of anything?" She shook her head. "Just ate in silence, like he's done lately. Then he got up, said he'd sit by the fire a while. I went upstairs. I must have fallen asleep. Found him this morning, just like this." Her words carried no flourish, no embellishment, just the bare bones of a story that asked for no deeper digging. Renshaw believed her. Why wouldn't he? She was Martha Whitlock. She'd hosted church lunches, tended the sick, taught 3 generations how to knit at the village hall. A woman like that didn't lie about things like this. He filled out his form with a stubby pencil, stood, and gave her a long look before speaking again. "Would you like me to call Reverend Millie?" he asked. "Or perhaps someone from the family?" She folded her hands. "No need," she said. "We didn't keep much family. I'll handle things." He hesitated, nodded, and offered a half-hearted smile. "I'm sorry for your loss, Martha." She looked past him, to the window, to the stillness beyond. "Yes," she said. "So am I." The funeral came quickly, not because anyone hurried it, but because there was so little to prepare. Gerald had lived a quiet life, and his departure fit the same pattern. No fanfare, no crowd, no long line of mourners to console a grieving widow. Martha arranged for a simple burial at the edge of the cemetery where the fence met the woods. She chose the spot herself, a gentle slope shaded by a tall sycamore, not out of sentiment, but because it was far enough from the other graves that she imagined no one would stop by without a reason. The ceremony was brief. Reverend Millie said a few verses, familiar and kind, and a cold wind danced through the air as if hushing the words before they could settle. Martha stood alone beside the casket, her hands clasped, her coat buttoned up to her neck, not for modesty but warmth. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. Her grief wasn't loud, wasn't theatrical. It existed quietly, like condensation on glass. The others present, Renshaw, 2 distant cousins, and Mrs. Delaney from across the lane, spoke little. They murmured their condolences with awkward sympathy, their faces unsure how to read a woman who had just buried her husband without letting her face fracture once. When the casket was lowered and the first scoop of soil landed on the wood, Martha blinked slowly and let her eyes fall to her feet. She stayed until the last spadeful had covered the grave, until the groundskeeper nodded once in her direction and walked away. She remained still for another few minutes, watching the breeze bend the grass around the fresh mound. It wasn't sorrow that kept her rooted there, nor memory. It was a quiet acknowledgement of something final. Not closure, not exactly, but conclusion. Returning home, she was struck by how easily the house accepted its new silence. It did not feel haunted or hollow, as one might expect after death passed through its halls. It simply felt still. She removed her coat, hung it on the same hook Gerald had always used, and stood for a moment in the entryway. The ticking of the hallway clock sounded louder now, each second falling like a measured breath. She walked to the kitchen without thought, opened the cupboard, and put on the kettle. Even in grief, or perhaps especially then, rituals mattered. As the water began to hum, she opened the window above the sink. A breeze swept through the room, stirring the curtain, bringing with it the smell of damp leaves and earth. She let it in. She moved through the house like a woman learning to live in a place for the first time, touching furniture, adjusting cushions, pausing to study the paintings on the wall, none of which had changed, yet all looked different now. In the sitting room, she picked up the book she'd started months ago but never finished, not because it wasn't interesting, but because Gerald had always interrupted her halfway through a chapter with complaints about the fire, the draft, the noise. She placed it on the table beside the sofa and made a mental note to begin again that evening. In the bedroom, she pulled the covers tight and fluffed the pillows, smoothing out the imprint his body had left behind. There was no reluctance in these tasks, only a gentle steadiness. Later, when the tea was ready, she brought her cup to the garden and sat on the old wooden bench beneath the plum tree, letting the steam warm her face while the birds hopped between branches overhead. The silence no longer pressed, it settled. It didn't ask anything of her. It didn't need to be filled. It simply was. In the weeks that followed, life in Belmere moved forward with the slow determination of a river winding its course, never rushing, never stopping. People spoke kindly of Gerald, mostly out of habit, recounting his quiet nature, his reliability, his fondness for the woods. No one asked too many questions about his death, and those who might have felt curious eventually let their thoughts drift elsewhere. In a place like Belmere, suspicions dried up quickly unless watered regularly by gossip, and Martha had given them none. She carried herself with the same warmth she always had, greeting people at the market, chatting with Mrs. Delaney on Tuesdays, and baking bread for the church's charity drive. Yet, beneath the surface, something in her had shifted. She no longer filled space with unnecessary words. Her speech became deliberate, her tone softer. When she laughed, it wasn't the bright, effusive sound it had once been, but something lower, richer, like a note played on a cello instead of a flute. It wasn't sadness nor guilt, it was evolution. She had spent years speaking to be heard, to keep the air between them from collapsing into nothingness. Now, she spoke only when she wanted to. She spent more time in the garden, tending to the soil, planting flowers that didn't bloom for months. The act of waiting, of cultivating something from silence, suited her. At night, she would sometimes walk through the house in her slippers, touching the doorframes lightly as she passed, not to check for ghosts, but to feel the wood, the grain, the memory of things. She had lived in that house with him for over 2 decades, and it would be dishonest to pretend it wasn't shaped by him. But it was hers now, in the way a space becomes yours when you are no longer fighting to share it. There were evenings, especially when the wind moved through the trees just right, that Martha would sit near the window and speak softly, not to anyone in particular, not with the expectation of being heard, but because some words still needed to be said. She spoke to the dusk, to the birds, to the memories that clung to the corners of the house like old wallpaper. Her voice had changed, not just in tone, but in weight. It carried the texture of a woman who had known what it meant to be silenced, and what it meant to survive it. Sometimes she would whisper, "You could have asked," though she no longer meant it as an accusation. Other nights, she would simply hum, letting the sound blend with the breeze, unforced, untamed. There were moments when the memory of Gerald flickered briefly, a cough she no longer had to pause for, a comment she once braced herself to receive, but they passed like the shadow of a bird over a stone wall. Not lingering, just passing. She no longer needed to revisit that night, nor relive it. It lived behind her now, not erased, but accepted. When she lay in bed alone, her breathing steady and unhindered, she did not long for companionship, only rest. And when the morning came, and the sunlight pushed through the curtains like fingers stretching after sleep, she rose, not hurried, not heavy-hearted, but whole. Not all stories end with vengeance. Not all wounds bleed. Sometimes the deepest cuts are the ones that never show, felt only when the silence finally returns, and it feels like freedom. Never underestimate the power of words, and never ignore the weight of silence. In every relationship, speak honestly but listen gently. Sometimes, all someone needs is to be heard. And sometimes silence isn't peace, it's pain no one dared to name. Choose to understand before you seek to be understood. Let your love speak in actions as much as in words, because when people stop talking, they often start breaking inside. Heavenly Father, teach us to cherish the voices you place around us, the laughter, the questions, even the imperfections of those we love. Give us ears that hear beyond the noise and hearts that are soft enough to understand what isn't said. May bitterness never take root where patience should grow. Heal every home where silence has become a stranger's weapon, and fill it instead with grace, understanding, and peace that speaks louder than pain. Where there's been hurt, let there be healing. Where there's been distance, bring closeness. Where hearts have grown tired, renew them with joy. And for every listener under the sound of this story, Lord, protect their peace, guide their relationships, and let them never be afraid to use their voice with love, with truth, and with courage. In your mighty and restoring name we pray, amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.